Well, our next speaker is Solange. Haas. That in the program the title is in French, but I can Solange that she already translated public decisions or not for COVID-19 with explanations. So I will tell you when you have 20 minutes.
Hello. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to present to you today and to be able to attend all these very interesting presentations. I'd like to introduce myself in a few words before starting with my presentation. So I'm a PhD student at Paris 1 at the SUHFECIM laboratory under the supervision of SUHFECIM-UNAM. And I'm also co-supervised by Philippe Jarre at the Center for Evolutive and Functional Ecology in Montpellier, which is a laboratory which is purely dedicated to scientific ecology. Okay. So my thesis is in philosophy of ecology and deals with models and predictions that are made in the context of public decision-making. So the aim is to understand how to make a firm decision based on an uncertain prediction. So to do this, I'm interested in the models that allow these anticipatory predictions to be made, so as to understand what makes it possible to take a decision and also what in the complexity of these models hinders it. So I therefore make a distinction between anticipatory predictions and corroborative predictions. The latter so aim to validate or invalidate a scientific hypothesis, whereas the anticipatory predictions announce a possible future world under certain assumptions in order to inform decision-making, a decision. So my work has been concomitant with the pandemic, and so I have been interested in COVID models and the public decisions that had been made based on these predictions made by available by the epidemiologists during the pandemic. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about compartmental models used to model the transmission of the virus between individuals, as well as zoonosis in general, with the guiding notion of the importance of the weight of explanations in decision-making. So the central question is what role does the explanatory character of a model play in a decision-making context? So this work is in progress, especially the whole second part of it. So I look forward for your comments, ideas, etc., to help me forward on these topics. No, okay. It was fun. So I'm going to talk about the explanatory weights of the different causes of epidemiological phenomena. So initially, I was going to talk about the compartmental models and conclude on the interest of the explanatory function of anticipatory models. So this is the subject of the first part, in which we will examine two epidemiological models used during the COVID-19 pandemic, which are realistic and explanatory in varying degrees. My reflection finally extended to the weight of explanatory explanations in causal networks, which finally occupies the whole second part of my presentation. So in a second step, through Northcott's writings on weighted explanations, we will apply his concepts to the causal networks that lead to zoonosis in general and not just the SARS-CoV-2. Without forgetting the question of the information that must be put forward to in order to inform good decision making, to make it possible to take good decisions. So, and all of this perhaps will shed some light on the reasons for the very mixed awareness of the link between zoonotic disease emergence and the destruction of nature, a subject on which I shall be very curious to hear your opinion at the end of the presentation, because I think it's very important and I hope it can give ideas about this. So in epidemiology, the SIR models are widely used. So here you have one example, a scheme of it. So they are compartmental models where in first approximation, each individual is in one of three possible states. So susceptible, infected, or recovered, which gives the name to the model. And at each step, all individuals are in one of the three possible states and will change or not its state according to probabilistic laws established by the model. So you can see here that you have a lambda probability to go from a susceptible state to a non-critical illness, and the theta probability to go to susceptible to critically ill, and then eta, etc., to critical care, and then recover or die. So you see that the idea is quite simple. It can be, of course, refined ad infinitum by adding constraints, additional hypotheses, but the compartmental structure remains, and it's roughly this one. So, for example, if you want to refine your model, you can arrange that each individual is in an abstract space to simulate the interactions between them within a social network. So this is an example that was used for COVID-19. So depending on the number and refinement of the assumptions made, these models can have variable accuracy in the sense that they can reflect reality with more or less accurately. So this scheme comes from an article by Samuel Alison, who works in the theoretical and experimental evolution team in Montpellier, and they did a lot of work in France to model the epidemic. So as an illustration of my problem, I take two models, the KISS and KIDS models, which are at two extremes of possibility in terms of realism. So to illustrate the distinction, we can place them on the Leibniz triangle. So this triangle that you can see here illustrates the thesis according to which models are subject to a necessary trade-off between three desirable characteristics: generality, realism, and precision. And so we have three categories of models, if each of which gives up one of the three characteristics. So Richard Levins is a biologist, and he based his thesis on examples from his field, but this trade-off has percolated beyond his field, so we use it here. So the KIDS model for keep it descriptive, stupid, which are precise and realistic, but not general because of their precision. So they are very specific to a certain geographical area, a certain time, type of social interaction, etc. And in practice, they rely on a lot of data that refine the assumptions. And then the KISS models, so for keep it simple, stupid, on the contrary, they are general, but not realistic and not very precise. That is, they will represent a very general phenomenon, but without accurate data to allow for a good prediction. So they ignore much of the specific data that would render them precise to a specific situation. I have chosen two examples to illustrate each type of modeling, KISS and KIDS. So here you can see an illustration of a model published in the Washington Post, which models what happens when people in a heavily infected city have the opportunity to move out of the city. So it's very simple. You see like the opening of the city on the left-hand side. And so it's basically a little animation, and the dots change color when they meet. And so the result of the simulation is trivial. So the individuals will go and affect the healthy individuals living outside the city. And here I say trivial in the sense that this prediction could be easily inferred without doing the simulation. You can imagine what will happen when you have the hypothesis. You don't need to do it. Nevertheless, it does allow, when you look at the animation, to give an idea of how quickly the individuals outside the city will be infected. And especially visually, it makes the infection mechanism very clear. So for the kids model, the publication of the Imperial College of London with Ferguson's team have been used a lot, particularly in France, but also in other countries, to take health measures during the pandemic. They are extremely heavy on hypothesis. That is, the causal chain disappears under the interweaving of hypothesis and data. They have a strong predictive power, which must nevertheless be put into perspective. Indeed, so first of all, you never know if some critical hypothesis has been forgotten, for example. You can also have threshold values. So in other words, the model's result can be very sensitive to the value of a certain data, which may not be correct. And this was a problem during the pandemic, particularly because we did not have the same quality of data depending on the countries. And so, which could seriously distort the prediction in countries where the data were not that precise. And finally, quite simply, in order to make a decision based on a model, which is, of course, a simplification of reality, one has to be aware of the assumptions that has been made in the model. And the fact that there are so many that one has the false impression that the model is perfectly realistic, and this can lead to misinterpretation and so to bad or decision making. So all this to say, in the end, that so the KISS models, although not very predictive, are not to be neglected in decision making. Their explanatory function, which highlights an aspect of the causal network at work in the phenomenon, makes it possible to eliminate certain shortcomings of the much more powerful kids models that were mostly used in terms of prediction. So we rely here on the work of Elliot Graves to defend the interest of vague or imprecise predictions, in her words. She defends such prediction in ecology for decision making. And so we use her work here. So the explanatory function of KISS models is what gives them their value in the decision process. And we will now look at the weight to be given to different explanations for an effect when it has different causes. And we will use the work, the Northcott's work, and his definition of weighted explanations, applying it to the emergence of zoonosis in general, not just SARS-CoV-2. And the idea is to present what needs to be emphasized in order to understand the risks associated with zoonosis and to enable the right decision to be taken. So first of all, what are zoonoses? So as you know, zoonoses are diseases and infections whose agents are naturally transmitted from animals to humans or from humans to animals. The terms come from zoon, animals, and nosos, disease. And which is important is that over the past 4 decades, more than 70% of the emerging infections have been found to be zoonotic. So some of these are sadly notorious. So we have Spanish flu, HIV, H1N1, the SARS-CoV-1, of course, the COVID-19, but also Ebola, Zika, chikungunya, etc., are all zoonoses. So now for the causes, I call this section, the coming decades will not only be warmer, but sicker. It's a statement that sums up this section very well. It comes from Gregory Albery, who works at the IPBES. Because climate change and the emergence of zoonosis have indeed interconnected causal networks. Climate change and modern land use are the causes of new opportunities for viral sharing between species that were previously isolated. That is to say, without human action, there are, of course, also encounters between animals and mammals that can cause zoonosis infecting humans. But what is important here to understand is that the modern destruction of nature drastically increases the probability of encounters, especially as many species have to change their geographical area due to global warming, to follow their ecological niche. So the causes are therefore, first of all, large-scale deforestation for the cultivation of soya to feed livestock or for the cultivation of palm oil, etc. The fragmentation of tropical forests and natural areas in general caused to road development, dams, mining, and urbanization. And thirdly, generally the globalization, which leads to movement of billions of people, goods, and animals also. So the causal network for the emergence of zoonosis is therefore very complex in terms of the number of causes involved, only some of which, of course, will actually lead to the emergence of a dangerous zoonosis. Depending on how far up the causal chain you look at, the whole causal network, you will have a different view of the public decisions you need to take to minimize the risk. And it's what we are going to see now. I just wanted to quote an expert from the IPBES, which is it's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I don't know if you know this expert. It's like the IPCC, but for biodiversity. So I just read, there is no great mystery about what caused the COVID-19 pandemic or any other modern pandemic. It is the same human activities that are causing climate change, biodiversity loss, and through their impact on our environment, the risk of a pandemic. Changes in the way we use land, the expansion and intensification of agriculture, the unsustainable trade, production, and consumption are disrupting nature and increasing contact between wildlife, livestock, pathogens, and humans. This is a path that leads straight to pandemics. So speaking of risks, here are some predictions on this subject. So the IPBES predicts that there are an estimated of 1.7 million undiscovered viruses currently present in mammals and birds, of which more than 800,000 may have the capacity to infect humans. An article by Carlson makes a simulation on 3,000 mammal species and finds that by 2070, 4,000 new interspecific transmissions of viruses will take place. So in total, it would be 15,000 new transmissions that should take place by 2070, where bats in tropical areas are particularly concerned. Moreover, which is interesting, staying below the 2 degrees Celsius by respecting the Paris agreements does not reduce the estimate of viral sharing because the ongoing warming is already strong enough to make these emergencies inevitable. It does not mean that we shouldn't agree with the Paris agreements, but so it's too late. So fortunately, most of them do not cause pandemics, of course, but as their number increase, so does the risk that pandemic will be triggered. While individual outbreaks are not predictable, patterns of emergence provide material for risk prevention. Thus, many articles call for a consolidation of the available data about which viruses, where, which mammals, and where they will go with climate change, etc. Of course, the uncertainties about the risks and the probability that the prediction is wrong must be clearly communicated and cannot be completely avoided. Thus, zoonotic risk artificial intelligence technologies that are used are not enough to prepare properly for a new pandemic, and the papers conclude that I could read that the care system would also be strengthened. But there is not a word about global warming and the destruction of nature. I have, of course, not made an exhaustive study, and I should perhaps do word research or something to have a better overview of these scientific articles on the prevention of COVID risks. But so from what I have read, I'm under the impression that if the strengthening of care system and hospital, etc., is very often mentioned, the reduction of the destruction of nature is not. That is to say, the care system of the country is seen as being part of the causal network, but the reflection doesn't always go down to the destruction of nature. And here I just counted the surprisingly few articles in the Monde, so the French newspapers, which is, I think, not commensurate with the risk. So to take a step back from the reasons to put forward for the emergence of zoonosis, I suggest looking at the writings of Northcott, who gives a new light on the importance to considering the underlying causes and not just the proximate ones that are put forward in the media, and gives a definition of the weighted explanation. So we will rely on the writings of Northcott, who proposes a clear definition of weighted explanations. That is, when some causes are more important than others. And to do this, he defines first what causal explanatory strength is, and then a weighted explanation. And for what interests, so he shows in particular that underlying causes need not be more important than proximate ones, which will be very interesting for us, that several different causes can each be responsible for most of an effect, that small causes need not be less important than big ones, and finally, that non-additive interactive effects between causes present no particular difficulty. The question now is, is it justified to consider only the proximal causes as it is done, in this case, medical care, and to neglect the structural causes, underlying causes that go back to the climate change? So as we have seen, the causal network for the emergence of zoonosis is very complex. So you have globalization of movements, deforestation, the market of wild animals, that leads to the destruction of nature, global warming, then the emergence of zoonose, and finally the transmission of the virus and the pandemic. So in the case of the emergence of zoonosis, the structural and proximate causes are not the same. Indeed, so each step is highly probabilistic, and only a few causal paths in all this causal network will actually lead to the emergence of a dangerous zoonosis. However, it seems important in this case to give equal or even greater explanatory weight to the underlying causes of nature destruction and pollution, etc., and climate change, to enable decision-making that takes the problem at the beginning. I take the example of global warming to see the difference. So this time the network is much more direct. So you have globalization, transport, factories, coal-fired power station, etc. That is pollution, and then to global warming. And by the way, the structural here this time the underlying and proximal causes merge. Indeed, all the structural causes I just mentioned, pollution, etc., have a direct impact on the progression of global warming. That was not the case. So for example, pollution is underlying in both cases and not proximal in the case of zoonosis, but is still very important. So following Northcott's lead, he shows that the structural and proximal causes can be equally important, or even you can give, you can choose the weight you want to give to the cause. That is, in the case of zoonosis, globalization can be considered as important a cause as wildlife markets in terms of the emergence of zoonosis. This would mean addressing not only the proximal causes, medical and wildlife market, but also the underlying causes in all its ramifications. But this is made more complicated to consider by the fact that not all structural causes are proximal causes, as in the case of climate change, global warming, for example. And so, as you see, I did not use all the conclusions that given by Northcott, but I just give them to you because I think they can be interesting to go forward for further reflection. To conclude, the explanatory function of anticipatory models is very important in the context of decision making. And the underlying causes of the emergence of zoonosis, for example, need to be highlighted for better design and prevention of the risks they pose. I think that a broader picture of the causal network may allow us to weigh differently the different causes that will or may cause the consequence we want to avoid. It seems to me that Northcott's view can help to reconsider the causes of emergence of zoonosis that are put forward in the explanations, with the idea, of course, that depending on which causes are put forward in the explanations, the choices that will be made the choices on which causes to tackle in priority will also change. So these questions actually touch, as you saw, a much broader issue, which I don't even pretend to be involved in, but which I find fascinating, and which involves many disciplines, including sociology, psychology, political science, economics, etc., and which is to know why the pandemic of COVID-19 was not the moment for environmental awareness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A wonderful presentation, wonderful topic. And we have